90,000 men, 12,000 horses and 37 war elephants entered the mountains in autumn. By the time they descended into Italy, fewer than half remained. Rome expected an army. What emerged from the Alps was a nightmare forged by ice, starvation and absolute will. Spring 218 BC. While Rome's Senate debated sending armies to Spain and Africa to crush Carthage, Hannibal was already moving. He understood something about warfare that Rome's traditional generals didn't. In war, the initiative belongs to whoever acts decisively, and defensive strategies are ultimately losing strategies. Rome expected to fight this war on their terms, in territories they chose, at times convenient to their mobilization schedule. Hannibal intended to shatter every one of those assumptions. His plan was audacious to the point of madness. He would march an army from Spain through southern Gaul over the Alps, a mountain range that had never been crossed by a military force, and invade Italy itself. He would take the war to Rome's heartland, strike at their Italian allies, and force Rome to fight on ground where their advantages in naval power and economic resources meant nothing. When his officers questioned the plan, Hannibal's response revealed his strategic thinking: "We will either find a way or make one." It wasn't bravado. It was a statement of methodology. Obstacles existed to be overcome, not to prevent action. But there was another element to his strategy, darker and more calculated. Hannibal knew Carthage's government wouldn't support this war enthusiastically. The merchant oligarchs wanted peace and profit. If he waited for their permission, for their funding, for their political backing, he'd wait forever. So he wouldn't wait. He'd create facts on the ground so dramatic that Carthage would have no choice but to support him, or be destroyed when Rome retaliated for his actions. It was a gamble of extraordinary magnitude. If he succeeded in reaching Italy and winning battles, Carthage would rally behind him. If he failed, they'd probably surrender him to Rome to make peace. Everything depended on success. There was no middle ground. The force Hannibal assembled in spring 218 BC was unlike anything Rome had faced before. 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry from across the western Mediterranean. Spanish tribesmen who fought with falcata swords and javelins. Libyan infantry in captured Roman armor. Numidian cavalry whose riding skills were legendary. Balearic slingers whose projectiles could crack skulls at 100 meters. Celtic mercenaries seeking plunder and glory. And 37 war elephants. African forest elephants, smaller than their Asian cousins but still massive, terrifying beasts that had been trained as living tanks. This wasn't a national army fighting for homeland. It was a coalition of mercenaries, allies and conquered peoples bound together by several things: respect for Hannibal's leadership, the promise of Roman plunder, regular payment, and the understanding that desertion meant death. Managing such a force required genius-level leadership. Different languages, different fighting styles, different motivations, different gods. A Carthaginian aristocrat commanding Carthaginian citizens could rely on shared culture and patriotism. Hannibal had no such luxury. He had to earn loyalty every day through competence, charisma, and carefully calibrated rewards and punishments. Before departing, he made careful arrangements. 20,000 troops would remain in Spain under his brother Hasdrubal's command to hold the territories they'd conquered and protect the supply base. Another garrison would defend North Africa. Hannibal would take only the mobile field army, the best troops, the most experienced commanders, the forces capable of the march ahead. Do you think bold strategies win wars, or just get people killed for nothing? Comment below and subscribe, because Hannibal's next 6 months will answer that question in ways that still shock military historians today. The Pyrenees, the mountain range separating Spain from Gaul, was hostile territory filled with Celtic and Iberian tribes that had no interest in letting a massive foreign army pass through their lands. These weren't civilized peoples who could be bribed or negotiated with easily. They were warrior cultures for whom raiding and ambush were normal activities. Hannibal fought his way across, losing men to constant skirmishing and guerrilla attacks. His rearguard battled tribesmen who rolled boulders down on marching columns, who struck at night, who poisoned water sources and burned supplies. Some of his Spanish troops, seeing the casualties and the impossible journey ahead, simply deserted. Thousands melted away into the mountains, returning to their villages rather than continuing this mad venture. Hannibal let them go. He could have hunted them down, made examples through brutal executions. Instead, he calculated that a smaller army of committed soldiers was better than a large force riddled with doubt and resentment. Better to lose the unwilling now than have them break at a critical moment later. By the time his army emerged from the Pyrenees into southern Gaul, it was already reduced. Perhaps 80,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry remained. The easy part was over. The Rhone River in autumn was wide, fast-flowing, and defended by hostile Gallic tribes on the far bank. Hannibal needed to get his entire army across, including the elephants, before Roman forces could intercept him. And the Romans were coming. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had rushed north from Rome with 2 legions, hoping to catch Hannibal during the vulnerable river crossing and destroy the Carthaginian army before it could threaten Italy. Hannibal's solution demonstrated his tactical creativity. While his main force constructed boats and rafts for the crossing, he sent a detachment upriver to ford at a shallow point. These troops crossed, then moved downriver and struck the Gallic defenders from behind while the main army crossed from the front. The crossing itself was chaos. Boats overturned in the current. Men drowned. Horses panicked. But the elephants created the most difficulty. Initially, Hannibal's handlers tried to ferry them on large rafts disguised with dirt to look like land. Several elephants panicked when they realized they were surrounded by water. Some capsized their rafts. Others leaped into the river and had to swim, their trunks held above water like snorkels, handlers clinging to their backs. Remarkably, most of the elephants survived. But the crossing took days, precious time that allowed Scipio to approach. When the Roman consul arrived at the Rhone, he found abandoned Carthaginian camps and local Gauls who told him the impossible. Hannibal had already crossed with his entire army, including elephants, and was marching inland toward the Alps. Scipio stood on the riverbank, staring at the evidence, realizing he'd been completely outmaneuvered. He faced a choice: pursue Hannibal toward the Alps or protect Italy's northern frontier. He chose to send his army to Spain under his brother's command while he himself rushed back to northern Italy to prepare defenses. Because now Scipio understood, Hannibal was really attempting the impossible. He was really going to try to cross the Alps. October 218 BC. The Alps loomed ahead, already dusted with early snow. Local Gallic guides warned that no army had ever crossed these particular passes in late season. The trails were narrow, treacherous, guarded by mountain tribes who viewed travelers as opportunities for plunder. Hannibal didn't care about precedent. His entire strategy depended on doing what Rome thought impossible. The first few days of the ascent were merely difficult. The trails narrowed. Pack horses lost their footing and plunged into ravines. The air grew thinner, making men gasp during exertion. But the army was still functioning, still maintaining cohesion. Then the real nightmare began. Mountain tribes, whose names are lost to history but whose impact is recorded in every source, began attacking. They didn't fight pitched battles. They rolled boulders down on marching columns. They struck at stragglers and wounded men. They poisoned water sources. They appeared suddenly from hidden positions, killed anyone they could reach, and vanished before Hannibal's troops could organize a response. The Carthaginian army's length became a liability. Stretched out along narrow mountain trails, the column could extend for miles. The vanguard might be under attack while the rear had no idea anything was happening. Communication was nearly impossible. Coordinated response was a fantasy. Hannibal's solution was brutal efficiency. He reorganized the march into more compact formations, placed his best troops at the front and rear where attacks were most likely, and ordered that anyone who couldn't keep up with the march would be abandoned. Wounded men who slowed their units were left behind. Sick soldiers were given the choice of struggling forward or staying to die. It was harsh, but Hannibal understood that saving the army meant sacrificing individuals. The cold became a more deadly enemy than the mountain tribesmen. October in the Alps meant temperatures below freezing at night. Soldiers who'd spent their lives in Mediterranean climates had no experience with such cold. They wore inadequate clothing, had no shelter beyond what they could improvise, and began dying of exposure. Frostbite was common. Men's feet froze in their boots. Their hands became useless. The elephants suffered horribly. These were African animals evolved for warm climates, now struggling through snow and ice. Several elephants fell off trails into chasms. Others simply collapsed from cold and exhaustion. Their handlers wept, then moved on because stopping meant dying. Subscribe now if you want to understand how leadership holds an army together when every rational person would quit, because what happens in the next week will separate Hannibal from every other general in history. Food ran out. The army had brought supplies, but not enough for a mountain crossing that was taking longer than planned. Soldiers began slaughtering pack animals for meat. When those ran out, they ate leather equipment, belts, straps, anything made from animal hide. They boiled it until it was soft enough to chew, deriving minimal nutrition but psychologically important sensation of eating something. Morale collapsed. Men who'd survived battles couldn't endure the cold and hunger. Desertions increased despite Hannibal's brutal enforcement of discipline. Some units threatened mutiny, arguing that continuing was suicide and they should turn back while they still could. Hannibal held them together through a combination of personal example and calculated manipulation. He marched at the front, sharing every hardship his troops endured. He slept in the open when they slept in the open. He ate what they ate, which often meant nothing. And he kept reminding them what waited on the other side: Italy. The richest farmland in the Mediterranean. Cities that had never been plundered. Wealth beyond imagination for men who'd grown up poor. All they had to do was survive a few more days of hardship, and everything they'd ever wanted would be within reach. It was a lie, or at least a massive exaggeration. But it was a necessary lie. The truth, that they were gambling everything on a desperate invasion with no guaranteed supply lines, no reinforcements, and no certainty that Italian allies would defect to their side. That truth would have destroyed what little morale remained. At one point, perhaps a week into the mountain crossing, the army encountered a disaster that nearly ended everything. A recent landslide had blocked the trail ahead. Thousands of tons of rock and earth made the path impassable. Backtracking would cost days they didn't have and would likely break the army's spirit completely. Hannibal's engineers proposed a solution drawn from mining techniques. They would build massive fires against the rock face, heat the stone until it was scorching hot, then pour vinegar, sour wine from the army's supplies, onto the heated rock. The rapid temperature change would crack the stone, making it possible to chip away enough rock to clear a new path. It took days. The army camped in the freezing mountains while engineers worked constantly. Soldiers not involved in the engineering effort had nothing to do except huddle together for warmth and contemplate their situation. This was probably the lowest point of morale. Men whispered that they'd followed Hannibal into a death trap, that they'd never reach Italy, that they were all going to die in these cursed mountains. But the technique worked. The stone cracked. Engineers chiseled through enough rock to create a passable trail. The army moved forward. Descent into hell. When the army finally began descending the eastern slopes toward Italy, they faced a final nightmare. The descent was steeper than the ascent. Snow-covered trails were treacherous. Men and animals slipped, slid, tumbled down slopes. Some managed to stop themselves. Others plunged hundreds of meters to their deaths. The elephants struggled most. Their broad feet, evolved for African savannas, couldn't gain traction on ice and snow. Handlers had to lead them step by careful step, sometimes spending hours moving a single elephant a few dozen meters. And through it all, the mountain tribes continued their attacks, now striking at an army weakened to the point of collapse. When Hannibal's army finally emerged into the Valley of northern Italy in late October or early November 218 BC, they were a fraction of what they'd been. Of 90,000 infantry, perhaps 20 to 26,000 remained, sources vary. Of 12,000 cavalry, around 6,000 survived. Most of the elephants were dead. The survivors were exhausted, half-starved, frostbitten, and traumatized by what they'd endured. They looked more like refugees than an invasion force. But they'd done it. They'd crossed the Alps. They'd achieved what Rome had dismissed as impossible fantasy. They stood on Italian soil, and ahead of them lay the richest, most powerful republic in the Mediterranean world, unprepared, undefended in the north, and about to discover that their worst nightmare had just arrived. Rome had assumed they had time. Time to mobilize their legions properly. Time to secure their Italian allies. Time to bring their vast resources to bear against Carthage and Spain and Africa. Hannibal had stolen that time. And in a few months, he would demonstrate that what he'd lost in numbers crossing the Alps, he'd gained in something more valuable. An army forged by shared suffering into an instrument of war that would annihilate everything Rome sent against it. What came next would be 3 hours of slaughter so perfectly orchestrated that it would be studied in military academies for the next 2,000 years. A battle that would make the Roman Republic question whether the gods had abandoned them. A tactical masterpiece that would prove Hannibal wasn't just a general willing to do the impossible. He was a genius who could turn geography, weather, and human psychology into weapons as deadly as any sword. Ed.